The mainstream media profits off your fear, and nothing is more illustrative of that than the back-to-school program that has been wildly successful in at least Alberta and generally across the country. But the mainstream media, well, they won't tell you that. The mainstream media loves a crisis, just like a war. It helps them provide wall-to-wall coverage 24/7. It helps them employ their staff, their journalists, and their spinsters. The same goes for the COVID crisis. And especially, this is illustrated very well by the back-to-school program in Alberta and across the country, in whichever province you are in. They'll tell you that it is despicable and selfish of the provincial governments to send their kids back to school. Keep in mind, the majority of provincial governments who are in charge of education, well, they're conservatives. New Brunswick actually just cemented their conservative leadership of the province just last night. The mainstream media has a vendetta against every single conservative provincial government, and the back-to-school programs are the way to get them. It's not just the mainstream media, though. Like I said, it's every leftist organization, from the leftist opposition in Alberta and every other province to the unions. Who could forget about them? The CUPE just said that Jason Kenney's plan is deficient. It's going to be dangerous to send kids back to school. Infections are going to be everywhere. Kids are going to die. The NDP, exactly the same, calling the plan dangerous. Well, the news from this week is that actually it isn't dangerous at all, and not one infection in Alberta, at least, has been spread within a school. On top of that, 98% of schools have had no infections in them at all.
I think it's important, though, to make explain what number of schools are carrying on and operating that haven't been impacted at all by COVID. And right now, there are 2,380 schools that are open and operating without any cases at all, which represents approximately 98% of schools in Alberta.
The mainstream media will go on and on and on about one or two infections here or there to make every single suburban mother terrified of Jason Kenney and his plan to send kids back to school. Maybe it's Doug Ford's plan to send kids back to school. Maybe it's Premier Higgs in New Brunswick's plan to send kids back to school. Now, of course, one of the main offenders, you couldn't personify the mainstream media trying to terrify suburban moms better than Mike
You watch me on TV.
Arcelides. You remember him. He's on Twitter almost every day trying to terrify you. 9 new confirmed cases, including 6 in Barrie, after Team RVH broke its single-day testing record on Monday, 356 tests. The mainstream media clearly is not on your side. They're there to terrify you for their own benefit and for the benefit of liberals in government and opposition across the country.
Hi, Dr. Henshaw. Thanks so much for taking the time to answer my question here. The World Health Organization is reporting a record one-day increase in global coronavirus cases. You did say off the top of your address that things are manageable by our public health here, but again, that numbers are rising. At what point do we reach that second wave or that concerning number that would change things? And any other reaction to our increasing numbers or that WHO stat?
Now, I called into this press conference because I had a few questions to ask. Interestingly enough, the deputy officer in Ontario said that about 50% of their tests on asymptomatic populations were false positives.
If you test somebody today, you only know if they're infected today. And in fact, if you're testing in a population that doesn't have very much COVID, you'll get false positives almost half the time.
Meaning that they weren't actually infected, but the government told them that they were, instilling fear on them and making the numbers rise even higher so that the mainstream media can double down on their reports to talk about how much of a crisis we're actually in, so that they can justify closing down the economy, closing down schools. Well, I had to ask the Alberta Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, that very question. What's going on here?
Ontario's Deputy Public Health Officer said that mass testing can yield up to 50% false positives. What is your estimate of false positives in Alberta? And if it's as large as it is in Ontario, why are we doing it? And are we delaying reopening the economy because of those false positives?
One of the challenges of asymptomatic mass testing is that it can pick up individuals who perhaps had COVID-19 maybe a month prior, perhaps they're no longer infectious, but they still could test positive if they're shedding the virus. And so one of the challenges, again, as we're doing the asymptomatic mass testing is to distinguish between those who perhaps are infectious, currently actively infectious, and those who maybe had infection a while ago. And that, I can't comment on exactly what the Ontario's Deputy Chief MOH had been commenting on, but that is one of the biggest challenges of that mass testing.
Now, I found her answer a little bit evasive, but what I want to point out about this press conference that I called into was how all of the other mainstream media journalists were acting. This was my very first time calling into a bureaucratic press conference. Normally I call into politicians to hold them accountable. That wasn't really the case here. I just wanted some facts from a bureaucrat. Now, what I found interesting was that the mainstream media, every question, was asking Dr. Hinshaw to dump on Jason Kenney, to make Jason Kenney the bad guy.
Hi, Dr. Hinshaw. Maybe I'm remembering this quickly, but early on in the pandemic, I thought I remember the Premier saying at some point this summer we would have the capacity to test about 20,000 Albertans every day. But today you're saying we shouldn't expect 19,000 tests on a daily basis. So am I misremembering that, or was perhaps the province just being a little over-optimistic in its ability to complete that high number of tests in a single day?
What's important to know about the number targeted for a single day is that we need to have surge capacity. So we need to have the ability to move through 20,000 tests in a single day if we should need to. And as we're looking at the fall, we know that we need to be able to move into a surge capacity if we should get increased circulation of other viruses like influenza, if we should see an increased spread of COVID-19, that we do need to have that ability to test that many people in a single day. But there's a difference between surge capacity, being able to test a certain number of people in a particular day, and the requirement to test that many people every single day for months and months.
Now, I like Dr. Hinshaw, I like her style, and you might have noticed that she didn't give the mainstream media journalists what they wanted. She gave a straight, clear, and concise answer that wasn't what the mainstream media was fishing for. I think Dr. Dina Hinshaw deserves just a little bit of credit here, if not just for how she's handled the back-to-school program in Alberta, but mainly because of how she manages to handle the socialist sycophants in the mainstream media for trying to politicize her position over and over and over again. For Rebel News, I'm Keean Bexte. Thanks for tuning into Rebel News. Be sure to subscribe to us here on YouTube. If you watch that video, you'll know very well that you can't trust the mainstream media with the coronavirus crisis or any other crisis. You can't trust them at all, in fact. Be sure to subscribe, and if you've already done that, ring the notification bell right next to it. That way you'll stay up to date with all of the news as it happens, and YouTube can't redirect your traffic to mainstream media sites whenever they want to.